The next stage in the cheese making process is to add a vegetable-based substance called rennet to the milk to clot it.
At the moment I've put the rennet in and you stir it for 4 minutes so it coagulates and it sets.
Rennet literally coagulates the proteins within the milk, and for the layman it sort of sets it like a large sort of blancmange.
The rennet clots the milk and will ultimately allow the creation of the curds, the solids which become cheese and liquid whey. It takes only an hour or so for the curd to form, for the milk to set or to clot. Cheese making is a skilled, very personal craft, and the curd is tested by hand. Once he's satisfied the milk is set and the curd is properly formed, the cheesemaker uses by hand a wire grid to cut it up into pieces so that the whey can drain away.
I'm cutting the cheese up now into cubicles so eventually the curd will sink and the whey come to the top.
Nothing's wasted. This liquid whey is drained off and used elsewhere in the food industry and for animal foods. There's still some whey left in the remaining curd, and this will be gradually drained off later. But now the curd is transferred from the milk vat, where it all began, to a cooling table where it was slowly set over the next 20 hours or so. The next morning the curd is cut into smaller blocks to speed up the draining and is then ready for milling. First the chunks of curd are milled down into smaller pieces. These are then hand salted to a special recipe. This is a key moment in the making of a Stilton cheese.
All parts within Stilton manufacture are important, but the even distribution of the salt within the curd is ultimately important to make good blue Stilton cheese.
This is a hands-on process where the personal skills of the Stilton cheesemaker makes a big difference.
Handcrafted side is very important to us. That is why we've got so many people in here sort of mixing the curd and the salt and actually hooping the product as well.
Hooping in a cylindrical mould is another traditional part of Stilton cheese making. This is where the cheese gets its characteristic round shape. Each cheese uses about 24 pounds or 11 kilograms of salted curd. In the hastening room, the cylinders of cheese are stored in a warm, moist atmosphere for 4 days and turned daily to give the cheese an even distribution of moisture. This drains the whey naturally. Stilton cheese is never pressed, and this creates a flaky, open texture ready for the bluing stage. After 5 days, the cheeses are firm enough to be taken out of their moulds for the next stage of smoothing. Again, this is done by hand for each individual cheese. This seals the cheese, gives it a regular smooth appearance, and prevents air entering the body of the cheese as it gently matures. The cheese is now transferred to another storeroom where the temperature and humidity is carefully controlled. This is one of the larger dairies and produces a significant proportion of all the Stilton cheese made, and there's several of these big stores. Each cheese is turned regularly during this ripening period. After about 5 weeks, the cheese will have formed its characteristic Stilton crust. They're now ready for piercing. Each Stilton is pierced with stainless steel needles to allow air into the body of the cheese to activate Stilton's famous blue cheese mould. This is where a Stilton's mystical blue veining begins. The veins don't follow the piercing holes but develop in the tiny cracks and fissures of this open textured cheese. The maturing cheeses are kept in cool, humidity-controlled stores where they may be pierced again to encourage further bluing. Once again, the cheeses are regularly turned while they're gradually maturing in this bluing store. Stilton is a quality food, and every batch of cheese is carefully graded or ironed.
He's looking for a good even consistency of bluing throughout the cheese for specific customers that we grade for. So I'm just looking for good quality, good even veining, good open texture.
These cheeses are still very young. Stilton cheeses are sold from between 8 and 11 weeks of age.
I do like a pre-grade at 6 weeks and one at 8 weeks, so I have a good idea of what the cheese quality is going to be around about 8 weeks, and who I feel is the cheese is going to be of a good maturity.
It's a very skilled job judging the taste, consistency and creaminess of the Stilton. If it's not up to the mark, it's not sold as Stilton, just blue cheese.
There's a very tight time window during which Stilton will ripen, and to show this point I've got 2 cheeses here, one at about 7 weeks of age and one at about 11 or 12 weeks of age. So if I iron the first cheese, I can feel it's quite a tight cheese, quite hard going into the cheese. And then if we look at the cheese, we can see we've got some blue veining forming going from the middle. It's not very dense and it hasn't reached the outer edge. The cheese itself is still quite white, and in terms of flavour, there's a sharpness there, a slight acidity, and the texture is not quite right. So if we put that back into the cheese. We now look at the second cheese, the more ripe cheese. Much softer body with the iron going into it. And here you can see the veining is now going right the way through to the edge of the cheese. The curd has become a bit darker, the blue veining has become a bit darker, and the whole body of the cheese is softer. And that's creamy in texture. There's a creamy background flavour, and there's a complexity of flavour that's just bouncing around the mouth. That is a good, ripe Stilton at about 12 weeks of age.
A Stilton cheese is very special. It has to be made from local milk from the 3 Stilton English counties, which has been pasteurised and is produced only in a traditional cylindrical shape. Its crust must form naturally and it must not be pressed. It must have delicate blue veins radiating from its centre, and of course it must have that distinctive Stilton taste. A prime mature Stilton can then be enjoyed for its buttery texture and rounded mellow flavour, the product of so much careful attention in its making. Stilton is much more than a fine way to end a good meal. There are also plenty of tasty modern recipes which are so easy to prepare. Starters like Stilton soup, Stilton stuffed mushrooms, or a Stilton salad. As a main course there's pasta with Stilton sauce, or pizza topped with Stilton, and an old favourite, cheeseburgers with Stilton cheese.
Well, I used to think it was associated with, old men with a glass of port sitting around, but after today I've seen that it can be used in modern ways and in modern cuisine. I had the pasta with the Stilton sauce, and I was really surprised because I thought Stilton was just eaten by itself, but I'd never tried it with pasta before, and it was really yummy.
It's very nice, it's different. You often think of it as being very, very kind of spicy, but in fact, I'd say mellow, creamy, and very, very, very nice actually.
The meal was just beautiful. The pasta, it was so delicate, the flavour. It was really creamy and much milder than I was expecting.
My palate tends to prefer mild food, and I've always associated something like Stilton as being very strong flavour. I was actually quite pleasantly surprised, just how mild it actually was, and quite creamy, which meant that I really liked it.
For these and other recipes, visit the Stilton Cheese website, www.stiltoncheese.com.